Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken with the Mises Institute. And with me today, this is our predictions episode. It's January 1. We're going to talk about the year 2025. And helping me with that is Tho Bishop and Zach Yost. Hopefully you are by now familiar with both of these guys. Zach, of course, my longtime co-host, and Zachary is our foreign policy guy. And we want to talk about some predictions that touch on a variety of topics. And I'm hoping the three of us have opinions on all of these. Now, I went back and I listened to last year's predictions episode. And we were right about a lot of those. For example, yes, the Fed ended up cutting rates. And yes, the economy got a little bit worse, but there wasn't a recession. Patrick Newman was our guest last year. And that, we didn't get everything wrong. Wasn't bad.
There you go.
However,
that's what we strive for.
the problem with that episode is it's an hour and 37 minutes long. But don't worry, folks. We'll keep it considerably shorter than that. That's got to be our longest episode ever.
Yeah. Well, that's Ryan's New Year's resolution, right there.
Yes. I can't handle that sort of length. Plus, I mean, I don't know, maybe for a lot of people it's New Year's Day, they're recovering from whatever partying they were doing the night before. They don't need some deep, long, drawn-out discussions here. But by the way, with 2025, we got a bunch of new events coming up. And boy, what do we got? We got in the spring, we got our Austrian Economics Research Conference. That's our academic conference in May. We've got our history of war, revisionism, our revisionist history of war conference coming up in May. There's a lot of stuff going on. So we've got some stuff coming up before then, though, don't we?
Yeah, in February we're going to be down in beautiful Tampa, Florida, looking at educational issues for the new year. Always enjoy that event. The Schrader family down there is always our hosts. If any Radio Rothbard listeners plan on going to that, shoot me an email. Would love to connect, but very excited for that one.
All right, well, let's talk about what's going to happen in 2025, other than the wonderful things that you can participate in, hosted by the Mises Institute. And by the way, you should subscribe if you haven't. That should be your New Year's resolution for 2025. Go to Mises.org, MISES.org. Click on subscribe. Up there at the top, you can choose either daily emails or weekly emails. You get notices about upcoming events, about discounts at the bookstore, all those sorts of things. And you also get even more of that if you click on the become a member button. And so even more benefits in that case, but you should definitely at least subscribe. Now, question 1 for predictions. Will there be a recession in 2025, and will the Fed raise its target rate? Let's start with you, Tho. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that we're already seeing a lot of signs of very real economic distress. We've seen this play out for really well over a year now. I think that we are going to enter official recession territory. I think Trump's reaction to that is going to be very interesting in its own right. He's trying to build a very camera-ready Treasury team. That's, I think, one of the interesting. You're going to see a very big dynamic in the sort of personalities from the communications front. I think you're going to see a big difference there between the Biden administration and Trump, just in terms of the optics of trying to control the message on the economy. They're going to try to do everything they can to elevate international investment coming in, things like that, trying to, I think, push back on some of the mess that they are inheriting, as we've discussed in a couple of episodes now since the election. But I would expect Powell to I don't see any rate hikes coming. I don't think there's going to be any pivoting there. I think that Powell's going to be trying to keep his seat, trying to do everything he can to avoid getting some of the dreaded Trump truths out there directed his way. So again, I wouldn't surprise me at all to see an official recession come up. I think there's going to be a big kind of counter-messaging dynamic from Trump. Part of it blaming on the past, part of it trying to identify big new things that are coming around the horizon, and the Fed will cut.
Well, I think one of the big dangers for the year is that when the economy does worsen, Trump's going to get blamed. Even though, of course, he shares blame in the fact that he wanted to blow up a huge monetary bubble in 2019 and 2020. He consistently pushed Powell for even easier money, which the Fed is already inclined to do, but they weren't even doing that enough to please Trump. So he sowed the seeds for the current bubble pop, if you will, back when he was president. The thing is, of course, he's no more to blame than Biden. President's gonna president in the sense of they come in, they want more spending, they want easy money to keep the economy looking good while they're president. Trump was basically the same as every other president in recent history on this. And yet, when the economy turns south, what we're going to be told is there was something about Trump. He was too capitalistic, or he cut taxes too much or something. And there's too little regulation. That'll probably be a big line of argument is laissez-faire magically returned yet again. There wasn't any government regulation to speak of under Trump is what we'll be told. And so that allowed the recession to come roaring in when it does. And it's a pretty safe bet at this point that we're going to see, even if that doesn't happen in 2025 in a noticeable capacity in terms of job losses, well, there's 3 more years of Trump after that. And so we all know what's going to happen. Trump and his alleged capitalism or his alleged lack of government regulation and not enough taxes, even though, of course, he's going to raise taxes with tariffs, will be all bad. And capitalism, yet again, will have caused all of our economic problems. And so Trump needs to be on messaging now. We've talked about this in a couple of previous episodes. And so there's a real danger there politically. But yeah, in terms of what's the economy doing, yeah, I think it's going to get worse. For example, just look at some recent data coming out of the Philadelphia Fed. They're readjusting all of these jobs numbers from 2024. And now they're saying, oh yeah, the second quarter of 2024, there wasn't actually any job growth then at all. So even though we were told that hundreds of thousands of jobs were added in that quarter back when the quarter was happening, back when we're in early 2024, mid 2024, we're being told it's all gangbusters and great. Well, now they're going back and saying, oh yeah, we made all those numbers up. Not on purpose, of course, it was just an honest mistake. But that's the reality of jobs based on the adjusted jobs data. So if you had 2 quarters of that, then you're dangerously close to recession territory yet again. So, and because of all that, because of those lackluster job numbers, I think the odds of the Fed raising interest rates are basically zero. We just look at what the Fed's been doing. It's repeatedly cut interest rates. It had that mega cut back in September, and then cut it twice more, brought down an entire percentage point from where it had peaked out at 5.5%. And that all speaks toward the Fed thinking the economy is quite weak. The Fed messaging on this is completely useless. The Fed says all sorts of things. What matters is what they're actually doing in terms of policy, and they're behaving like there's an impending recession. That is what all historical experience points toward. The Fed is behaving as it does right before a recession occurs because it fears economic decline, and that's why it starts cutting rates. It doesn't cut rates for other reasons. It never has historically, regardless of what it might say. So that's what I think is the situation for 2025. Inflation has bottomed out in the sense of in this last quarter or in this last month when we look at November's CPI, core CPI, a couple other indicators. It's not heading down to 2.0%. It's not heading down to that 2% inflation target. It's actually heading slightly back up in the new numbers, and it's looking more like the new target is closer to 3%, 2.8, 2.9%. That's where things are settling in terms of the price inflation front. So it looks like the Fed is actually willing to tolerate higher inflation and isn't really serious about its 2% goal, because I cannot see them raising interest rates because of the need to keep the economy humming to some extent. They're really worried about actual job losses. So without some sort of rate hike or allowing the rate to rise some more, you're just going to continue to see more of this built-in inflation. So you really are looking, I think, at more of a 3% year rather than a 2%, as the Fed has consistently promised it would deliver.
Yeah, this is definitely not my area of expertise. I usually go to Ryan and Peter St. Onge to try and understand what's going on, but just from my very layman's perspective, I agree that I think it's very hard to see the Fed's raising rate, especially because Trump seems to hate that and will definitely harangue whoever needs harangued to try and prevent that, I'd imagine.
Well, and Zach, you're just a normal person, so you see people out in the economy. I don't, outside of wealthy economists who have jobs at the New York Times and academics who have very cushy government jobs and such, I don't hear from anybody about how amazing the economy is right now. If anything, I hear from people who lost their jobs, and they are able to find jobs after several months of serious effort. But that's not what I would describe as a red-hot economy. But that's the sort of rhetoric you're getting from establishment economists in the Fed.
Yeah, on the job front, I mean, it's a little scary seeing people I know talk about being on the job hunt. I mean, people are submitting hundreds of resumes before they even get an interview and things. Prices in the grocery store, I mean, I definitely feel they've gone up. But, I mean, and I know there's other factors at play here like bird flu, but, like, I buy eggs in bulk at Sam's Club. Just from earlier this year when I bought like 90 eggs, the price has gone up 25%. And I was like, holy moly, what's going on here? So I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm a normal person. That might be giving me too much credit. But all the normal people I interact with are definitely confirming that things are not pleasant, which definitely, of course, fueled Trump's reelection for sure.
And I think kind of a C story to this, which is going to be interesting, is going to be kind of the left wing or the Democrat response to this situation. And so kind of an extra little prediction there. I think we're going to start seeing the rise of the kind of like the non-woke socialists. I think you're going to start seeing a broader coalition of people that are going to criticize the centrist policies of Obama, Biden. I think that you're going to have more probably an establishment sort of Obama-era comeback in terms of the leadership and machinery of the DNC, like Ari Emanuel or someone like that as DNC chair. And I think that's going to open up the door for a left-wing sort of populist, almost kind of tapping into kind of almost a similar sort of energy that RFK had in certain ways, of that sort of non-woke, big government Democrat, someone like a Fetterman as he has rebranded himself kind of right now. I think that's just kind of another aspect in terms of the political response to some of these economic headwinds.
Well, that certainly would work against our next question, the question of, will there be any meaningful fiscal reform? Of course, if economic populism only gets more popular, we can forget about that, because that's going to be all about big spending. If economic populism is, Trump already harnesses the power of economic populism in many cases. That's what a lot of the tariff discussion is. And also Trump has never, ever suggested any sort of cuts to Social Security or Medicare or anything like that, right? It's just don't talk about popular social benefits. Talk about creating jobs for people via tariffs, which is a terrible economic argument, but politically it's not bad. And so where's the fiscal reform going to come from? I don't see it, but there's certainly plenty of discussion about it. And I saw that Trump tweeted about how they were going to get hundreds of billions of dollars of savings out of Doge and whatever plans they had for new omnibus bills going forward and whatever the spending plans were. That would be interesting if that happened, but I am skeptical that there will be anything totaling hundreds of billions of dollars. I can certainly see some piecemeal cuts here and there, but anything that gets cut in terms of, say, social welfare is just going to end up going into defense or, say, immigration enforcement and those other sorts of things. There's plenty of ways they can justify lots of new spending. And so I don't see any significant cuts in deficits. Also, they could cut spending significantly, but if the economy slows and tax revenues decline, then you're going to not make any headway at all on deficits, because you need both high tax revenue and spending cuts to really chip away at the deficit. And I don't think either of those things is really on the menu. If anything, we're going to see declines in government revenue as the economy slows, and that's not going to be covered by any significant declines in spending. So that's a big no for me. I know that a lot of Trump supporters are deeply emotionally invested in their guy, and they're convinced that there's going to be big changes. But I think that's imaginary, and there's no evidence, certainly nothing out of the first Trump term, to suggest that is what is going to happen. And so we'll know in 90 days or something if it's even trending in that direction, but I'll be shocked if it does.
Well, if I try to present a narrative that I think could a more optimistic view there. Now, whether or not it's a prediction or not, right? My prediction is I'm always going to expect DC to operate as DC does. But if there is a path for a follow through of, say, the Doge, Elon Musk, Vivek project working, just kind of break the magic with our listeners here. We're recording this on December 20th. We've just had a couple days of the CR debates going on. We had the defeat of the 1,500-page bill. We had the defeat last night of the much shorter 115-page bill that had the Farm Bill and the emergency relief there. We have no idea how this is going to respond as we are recording right now. But what it's demonstrating there is that you've got 30-something members of Congress that are still trying to dig in, that they're willing to say no to Trump, that are taking the spending issue seriously and not simply going along with following the leader there. Now, how this goes into how Trump will govern, you can go one of two directions, right? Is the response, and I think this early one will kind of be an interesting demonstration of it. There's two paths you can go to. One is you can try to create a coalition with enough Democratic legislators. I mean, that's how the big monstrosity bill that got shot down the first time around, that Elon and Vivek and Donald Trump Jr. and all these public surrogates, actively ridiculed and destroyed, right? That was a product of bipartisan cooperation there, trying to figure out spending priorities, and of course, ton of absolute crap was added to it. The other side of it is trying to use Doge and to identify not systemic reform, right, not addressing the entitlements and things like that, but trying to find as a negotiation, as a point of leverage on trying to keep that very, very narrow House majority within line. Are they able to find enough areas of cuts to help use that as a bargaining chip to get enough of a Republican coalition together that they don't have to deal with this again in the future, right? Could you get, for example, a kicking the can down the road, a significant delay in the debt ceiling aspect of it, in exchange for actual concrete cuts now that can not only get through the slim majority in the House, but can actually get over the 53 senators and keep the coalition together in the House. Now, again, my expectation is that you're going to end up having some sort of bipartisan cooperation on the other side, and it's going to get worse and worse. If, however, if there's an ability to identify, here's sort of the low-hanging fruit on spending, this is enough to kind of create a functioning coalition government within the Republican Party, which essentially what you have, right? You've got 30 people in the Republican Party that are essentially ideologically disconnected from the follow the leader mentality that's governing the caucus as a whole. Then I think that is a dynamic where you have both kind of the interesting outside interests with Elon and Vivek, and so the public facing of it, combined with some of the tools that you're going to need in terms of interparliamentary politics. And so that is, if those two things can align, I could see something resembling some actual cuts into discretionary spending, some adjustments made to the margin, and not dealing with the systemic stuff, but can actually start getting in the right direction. And I think if you accomplish that, I think that is a necessary component for larger or for momentum on a larger scale. That if the U.S. is able to accomplish that relative to the rest of the world with the issues that every other major government is having on with their spending and debt issues, I think that is something that can be sold as a advantage for Trump when it comes to larger economic issues, geopolitical issues, and things like that. So that's the one narrative where I could see a positive outlining there. Whether or not that should be predicted is a different question, kind of depending on how cynical you view DC these days.
Yes, I would say I'm more on the hopeful side with an asterisk, though. And so I'd say there's sort of two parts here to my view on the issue. On the one side, I think, at least for me, that I have to have hope that there is a potential that something good can happen, because the country's, headed down the tubes, as it were, on sort of every metric possible. And if I don't think there's really going to be a better chance of fixing these issues. So I hope that they're able to be fixed, at least somewhat, because if no discernible progress is made, if the Doge turns out to just be a flop, and Musk is unfortunately ends up just ranting on Twitter about what needs done and nothing happens, well, then that leads to the question of, okay, well, what's next then? And I don't know what's next, but it's not going to be good in many numerous scenarios of the not goodness, but much worse than things are now. So on the one hand, I just have to say I have hope, and I think, there's a chance things might improve, even though the track record is things not improving. If that track record continues, then, well, I don't know, maybe need to move to El Salvador or Argentina or, the middle of Alaska. I don't know what to do. But
And I think a big part of this is how internalized, like how much does the Trump administration understand that they actually need these cuts? Like this is not simply, sort of paying lip service to conservative ideas. This is not simply trying to create the coalition. That for them to have a success as an administration, again, I think the key measurement of is it easier to buy a house in 4 years than it was at the time of Trump's election this time around, as kind of the bellwether on the success of those 4 years in terms of the eyes of normal people. How much do they actually understand that spending cuts is not simply a luxury to check a box to kind of boost your resume as being better than Reagan, right? And how much of that is key to the essential measure of success as they had themselves have defined it? I think, and I don't know. I don't know the question. I think there's some people that get it. I think there's a lot of people that don't. I think I think is really interesting in terms of what is the thinking of the Trump administration in terms of these things.
And the second, this is on the sort of brass tacks side of things. The second half of my cautious optimism is where I think things do have a chance of happening. Yeah, I don't see entitlements being touched. But what I think can make a huge difference is attacking the regulatory state. It's becoming stifling, and this is why I'm sort of optimistic about Musk's involvement. He's practically moved into Mar-a-Lago. He sees how the state is just choking out the potential for economic growth, or even just continuing to function, the economy to function as it is now. I don't know if he will be successful, but I think he and other people will be motivated to attack the regulatory state, which is, we might not get all the spending cuts we want. Hopefully they'll slash some. I really think there's going to be a tax on all the government subsidization of higher education, because people realized, the federal government is just subsidizing all these woke crazy people who, are trying to undermine the foundations of society, as it were. So I think there'll be a strong constituency to attack higher education funding, not only just through things like student loans, but also all these ridiculous grants that are shoveled out to universities. So it'd be good to see some spending cuts, but I'm really hoping if, they just take a machete to the regulatory state, that might result in some potentially dramatic economic growth that, will down the road in the long term help alleviate some of the fiscal pressure, as it were. If they could at least just hold the line on spending, that would allow some breathing room down the road if the economy is unshackled from having to, employ all these useless bureaucrats, both in the state and state-adjacent institutions.
Well, back when Ron Paul was running in 2012, one of his positions in the campaign was to reduce federal spending to 2009 levels, which were, of course, already huge, but was a bit of a cut. And that was treated as just absolutely bonkers. That 2009, that was ancient history at that point. You can't go back from 2012 to 2009. The reality, of course, had they done that, that would have been a huge boost to the economy. It would have brought down interest rates. It would have been amazing. And just holding the line on spending, as you say, would have made a big difference. You don't even have to talk about cutting trillions of dollars in spending overall, just maybe stop increasing the spending. That would be just an amazing benefit to so many Americans. But boy, Washington just acts like that is just absolutely insane sort of policy making. But I think to a normal person, that would seem quite reasonable to just, hey, you're out of money, you're deeply in debt, maybe just cut off spending increases. But that it remains to be seen how close we'll even get to that. But I think it's important to emphasize that we're not even calling for massive regulatory or massive revolutionary changes here. Just maybe some changes that would seem sane to a normal person, but which seem totally impossible to Washington and the way people there think. All right, well, number 3. We'll start with you, Zach, on this one. Will the U.S. and Russia negotiate a truce in Ukraine in 2025? What do you think? What are the odds of that?
I'd say the odds are low. I mean, it's quite possible there might be some negotiations happening, but actually being implemented, I would not bet the farm on that for some specific reasons here. One, Russia's winning. And they're not going to want to just take a weak deal when they're, as it were, in the driver's seat. Ukraine faces 2 crucial issues. One is they need Western weapons, and there's not many more Western weapons left to give them. The big thing that's in need is 155 millimeter artillery shells. And I haven't checked recently, but I believe that the government has sort of stopped reporting their progress on trying to meet their goal of producing 100,000 shells a month. So I assume that means it's not going well. There's numerous other problems with our military manufacturing system. And the same for Europe. On the open market, as it were, a 155 millimeter artillery shell goes for about $8,000 last I checked. That's sort of a lot of money, considering that the whole point of basically artillery is you saturate an area with fire. So a lot of these shells aren't going to hit anything. So that's problem 1. Problem 2 is even if the U.S. just, due to its bureaucratic incompetence, just found a warehouse somewhere stuffed full of enough weapons to fight World War III with, there's not enough Ukrainians to wield those weapons, or at least not enough Ukrainians willing to join the military. This has been reported in the mainstream press since at least last year, last year being 2023, that, there's an immense amount of draft dodging. People are drowning trying to swim the Tisa River, which is the border between Romania and Ukraine. People are freezing to death in the Carpathian Mountains trying to escape Ukraine. And also lots of bribery, corruption, just, to let people across the border. Now, remarkably, and it's sort of stunning that Ukraine has even admitted this, as of October of 2024, they reported there had been 100,000 prosecution cases opened up. So the actual amount of desertion might be higher, potentially. And 60,000 of those cases were opened up between January and October of 2024. Now, people were pointing this out a bit prematurely, but people have pointed out, wars of attrition can drag on for quite a while, and then they can end rather suddenly when one side sort of just cracks up because they've lost the will and potentially ability to fight. Now, I'm not predicting this will happen. I'm just saying that it is a potential out there that the Ukrainian military could just collapse to a significant degree. This is not to say Russia will then be blitzkrieging into Kiev, but it could have some potential ramifications. And I mean, this is sort of what happened to Germany in World War I. It just sort of all fell apart. Soldiers were fed up. Everyone was starving at home. I mean, Russia's continued its campaign of infrastructure degradation against Ukraine. And I mean, Ukraine basically seems to be extremely lacking in air defenses. They're firing off those ATACMS, or however you want to say that acronym. I mean, all of the stuff they're doing is pointless from a strategic point of view. Assassinating generals in Moscow, using these long-range missiles to hit things in Russia proper. It might be great for saying, oh, we're striking back against Russia, but it's not changing things on the battlefield, which is where things actually matter. Morale among Ukrainian troops is definitely low. There's reports of mass desertions. I mean, I really have no way of judging how accurate such reports are. It's not crazy. I mean, I've seen some videos from even last year, being 2023, of large groups of Ukrainians sort of surrendering because they don't really want to die. So I don't think things are going to go well for Ukraine. I think Russia is going to want to keep pushing to secure whatever they've ultimately determined they desire to secure. John Mearsheimer, back at the beginning of 2023, predicted, I believe, they'd try and take another 2 or 4 oblasts. I can't remember now. One being Kharkiv, one being Odessa. And from a strategic point of view, seizing Odessa would make sense if they can do it, because then Ukraine's cut off from the coastline, historically a very pro-Russian population there, and other reasons. I don't know if it's feasible for them. I don't know if that's actually what they want to do. I'm just saying it wouldn't be surprising if they tried to do that. So future's radically uncertain, though, but I doubt there'll be a nice, happy bow put on this conflict in 2025.
So from the Russian point of view, you're right. Yeah, I agree. I don't see much motivation to pursue negotiations there. But what about from the U.S. point of view, though? Is there any motivation in the Beltway? Like, what's in it for Trump really to stick his neck out on the Ukraine issue? I could see maybe cutting back some spending on it a little bit, but I don't know. It's going to require real effort, I would think, to do some real negotiation there. Is it worth his time?
I think this is going to be a priority for Trump. I think this is going to be what leads every discussion that he has with European leaders, trying to reset relations there. The way that I could see this playing out is, I think that the breakthrough to negotiations is going to be a change in leadership in Ukraine. I think that Zelensky will not survive. I mean, politically, I'm not saying he's going to be assassinated or anything like that. I think that there's a very high likelihood that you're going to see corruption issues with the Zelensky government start becoming a major story. I think it's going to be something the Trump administration pushes. And I think part of the negotiation with Russia, what Russia gets out of this is a change of political leadership within Ukraine that is not going to continue the war unofficially if you have some sort of negotiated truce. And so I think that you're going to see so if I'm going to make a big, bold prediction there, I think that Zelensky's time as leader of Ukraine will be a part of the broader negotiations for peace. But I do think that this is one of the priorities. I think that in terms of legacy, in terms of international branding, I think Trump takes seriously this idea of him as peacemaker. And so I think this is going to be a top priority with Trump. I think you're already seeing degraded support amongst Republicans on this issue. You have people lamenting it. You had Dan Crenshaw out there saying, "Oh, golly gosh darn, Republicans are losing interest in this war because Trump supporters are yelling at them." So I think that American support is decaying. I think that the question is going to be, do European leaders really care about the sort of morality play that they have viewed this conflict with, at least publicly, more than they care about the relationship with the Trump administration? And I think that ultimately, I think political change in Ukraine, I think is going to be an essential part for anything that is going to resemble a genuine deal there.
All right. Well, number 4 is a related issue. Number 4 is, will Washington ratchet up its position against Iran? This is, of course, related to the Syria issue. right? Syria and Iran are traditional allies, at least in recent decades. And the whole Iran, Syria, Lebanon agreements to assist in, well, impeding, I think, Israeli and American power in the region. So the question is, now that Syria is out of the picture, this really does free up to some extent the U.S. and Israel to really turn their sights on Iran. But I don't know. I'm a little bit hopeful about Trump. Looking at Trump's first term, he engaged in a lot of performative opposition to Iran. He didn't seem particularly really interested in any sort of real aggression there in terms of actual invasion, boots on the ground, massive amounts of new spending. And part of that could just be driven by the realities of the situation, and that Iran's a much larger country than any of these other countries that the U.S. has been looking at in recent decades, right? In terms of population and capability, Iran is in a much better situation than Iraq, than Afghanistan, than Syria, than Lebanon. And so what does that mean for Trump? He has more leeway now because of the Syria situation, but is he interested, or is he just really, Zach, going to kind of say some things to placate the neocons in Washington and really just leave it at that? What do you think?
Well, he's on the record. It was some podcast, something Bet David. I can't remember his name, but he apparently blew up this year because I'd never heard of him before, but now I see him frequently. But Trump said, we don't want regime change in Iran. We don't want to get involved in that. And so that was like, wow, that's great to hear. With Syria just collapsing spectacularly and definitely unexpected on my end, I would not have predicted that at the end of 2023. But I'm optimistic there. The question is, what is Israel going to do? Israel's going gangbusters right now in Syria, basically seizing territory that I don't expect Syria or whatever its de facto or de jure government will be getting back anytime soon, including the largest mountain in Syria, which is interesting. People were pointing out, like, this is significant in terms of radar stations and things. But I'm not sure if Syria is just going to collapse into a big mess. We do have, now it's come out, 2,000 soldiers there, more than double what was reported. So, more lies. But Israel, as I was saying, is going to play a big role. And, of course, the people supporting Israel here in the U.S., what they're advocating for, will also play a big role, with Rubio being Secretary of State. I don't know what to expect there. I can't see Israel ratcheting up much more conflict, though, because I think they're sort of... all this fighting is extremely expensive for them, and their army is basically a reserve army. So when they call people up, the economy takes a major hit. I think one way we'll see of what happens is what the emphasis on China is. If there's a big emphasis on China, and I'm still waiting to see some personnel choices there, well, then I think it's a safe bet that this administration is going to, kick the Middle East into the cupboard, as it were, and not care as much about it anymore. And potentially even try, this is hard to imagine, but, China gets a lot of its oil from Iran. Trying to have some sort of rapprochement or whatever with Iran could be beneficial in balancing against China. That might be pretty difficult to pull off after now four decades of animosity and open hatred. But I'm mildly optimistic on that front as well, on the not ratcheting up with Iran front.
Tho, what do you think?
I think Trump wants an Iran deal. And I think he wanted an Iran deal the first time around as well. What happened there is that Trump's style of diplomacy, right, is escalation for negotiation. And what happened is that the first time around, Trump immediately escalated on Iran, and the response from the Iranian regime was, "We're not going to negotiate," right? And so I think Iran, just looking from their own perspective, right? I think Iran misplayed that. I think Trump was a little surprised by that as well. And what's interesting is a couple weeks ago there was an article in the New York Times by essentially kind of Iran proxy identifying kind of what does Iran want in a deal. And I think that's part of some of the back roads, behind the scenes sort of conversations. I think that's a signal that Iran is interested in playing ball with Trump this time around. And I think Trump wants to play ball. There's some new figures, I think, within Trump orbit with unique ties to the Middle East, right? You have a new Jared Kushner in the form of Tiffany Trump's husband, who is Lebanese. I think his father has been put into a diplomatic relationship over there. I think that there are pieces in place. I think there's interest within Trump world. And I think Trump sees as a legacy-defining aspect being the deal maker, being the peacemaker. And so it wouldn't. And also, I think an interesting component of U.S.-Israeli relations is that Trump's relationship with Netanyahu is very different relative to what one would expect, given the way that Trump talks about Israel writ large, right? Like immediately after October 7th, right, Trump was bashing Netanyahu in front of his crowds. He kind of walked away from that because that didn't play too well with certain circles there. But I don't think Trump is going to be a complete sycophant for Netanyahu. Obviously, there's larger kind of interesting political struggles that Netanyahu has within Israel himself and the motivations that has in terms of how he conducts foreign policy, I think is a subject itself worth noting there. But I think that in many ways, just the way that Nixon was the only one that could go to China, I think Trump is in a unique situation, both with his strong ties to Israel and the way that he is viewed there by the population, and just some of his different pieces around him. I think he is someone who could get that. I think he's the only Republican, for example, who would get that done. So I'm pretty optimistic there. I think there's again, whether or not it happens in this next calendar year is a different question. But I think that is going to be one of those topics that has reason. There's reason for optimism, and of course, we're one bad day from all those hopes being completely put away.
All right.
Well, just on that real quick, I'd also add that right before the election, there was a report that Israeli policymakers were actually of the mind that Trump would probably push them to wind down the conflicts were he to win. That was something they were sort of preparing for themselves to do, and potentially that was pushing them to do more now, because it's like, oh, Trump's going to come in and shut the, turn off the spigot of cash and weapons, so we're going to have to wrap this up. That'd be great if that happened, but encouraging that it's at least speculated.
Yeah, the fact that you can even say these things is a bit of a departure, I think, from the usual discussion. Now, to wrap things up, we got question number 5 here. This is back on the domestic front. This is about national divorce. Remember that? This is something that would occasionally get brought up when Biden was president. Well, this is the way it works, right? Trump wins and California talks about national divorce. California doesn't want to be ruled over by Trump, so they talk about leaving the United States. Then Biden wins and California doesn't mention that anymore, but then instead you've got people like, Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about that from a Republican perspective, or a quote-unquote red state perspective. I haven't heard much about it at all. She brought it up again just very briefly after the latest election, and I was hoping California would start talking about it a little bit more. But the question is, where's that issue in terms of the national discussion? Now, in the long term, right? And of course, we're just talking about short term here. In the long term, most large countries break up into smaller pieces. This is just how it works. And no country lasts forever. If your whole worldview is tied to the forever existence of the United States, I've got bad news for you. That's not going to happen. The question, though, is in the short term, where is that issue, if anywhere, or is it just something that we're on a frozen path in terms of that, in the sense of that? And this is something Tho and I mentioned back before the election, was if Trump wins, this really delays a lot of the deeper discussion that needs to happen in terms of red states and blue states and woke people and non-woke people. How long can they survive in the same country without that country becoming totally authoritarian just in the style of, hey, dissent isn't allowed? Because that's how, once you have countries start to become very different in terms of their social preferences, their economic preferences, the only way they can be held together is by an authoritarian state. Otherwise, they tend to break up. Well, okay, is anybody talking about that right now? Or is this just something we're not even going to hear anything about until 2028? And then we're looking at the people are freaking out again about who wins that election. But it's just really hard to see right now what the state of that discussion is, or if people just feel like the problems have been addressed. I don't think the larger issues have been addressed at all, but it seems that there's a lot of groups have been somehow placated with the current state of affairs. But I don't know. Tho, what do you think?
I think we're kind of in a frozen landscape there, because I think the issues that are going to spark the most tension between kind of D.C. and blue states or blue cities are going to be issues that have now become normalized in Trump's direction. And so you can think about it in terms of immigration enforcement. You can think about it in terms of crime. You have these sort of security-related issues where even amongst Democrats, in particular the coalitions that Democrats historically have been able to rely upon, right? Hispanic voters, black voters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that when it comes to where are going to be kind of the heavy-handed areas that Trump goes in and tries to enforce things, I think you're going to have perhaps particular cities stand up. We've seen, for example, like the mayor of Boston, right, and things like that. You'll probably have Gavin Newsom. I expect that there'll be some agitation from certain sort of state governors, but I think it's gonna be a lot less than it was. I mean, Newsom and Cuomo, for example, like during COVID, right? Cuomo was basically out there quoting Calhoun during the COVID response sort of stuff, and I think that dynamic. I think part of it is because Trump won the popular vote. I think part of it is because of some of those issues that you've had broad public opinion swings. I think that with a few, I think those are going to be the areas where you're going to see the tension mount. But for example, I think we're going to see the mayor of New York City, right, going to cooperate with the Trump administration when it comes to immigration enforcement. Now, is he trying to get a pardon out of that? Probably. But I think they can read polls as well as anyone, and I think some of those really, really polarizing issues are. That were the kind of the catalyst for some of this sort of stuff the first time around. I think the underlying dynamics have changed in a way that I think you're not going to see that same sort of tension on security and immigration issues the same way that you saw in 2018 America.
Yeah, we should note, of course, that I think a lot of the talk has been quelled by this narrative that Trump won a stunning victory. And certainly his support is far more broad than it was in 2016, won more states, won them by bigger margins in many cases, and did not lose the popular vote. But we should note that his victory in the popular vote, it doesn't look like he even got a majority. He won a plurality because it's like...
Yeah, so 1.5%.
It's 49.9% the last time I checked. On that, and that's better.
They're probably still counting votes in California too. So.
Right, they're still counting. So he beat Kamala in the popular vote. This is indisputable, right? But because she got like 48%. However, and this is a larger trend too, right? In that there haven't been many elections won by any sort of sizable majority in the popular vote in 25 years. Clinton failed to win a majority twice in a row, and Bush, of course, was tiny. Bush lost the popular vote in 2000, did all right in 2004. Obama did quite well in 2008, but then you're back to these razor-thin margins, 50%, and now we're at 49% again. And, of course, Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. So this narrative that there was this overwhelming victory is hung on some pretty thin reeds, and this idea that the country is all united and come together behind any candidate, there's zero evidence of that from what I've seen. So I think the medium-term issues haven't been addressed at all here. But yeah, I definitely agree, though. The situation is markedly different in a variety of ways from what it was in 2016, just in terms of how much people are willing to oppose Trump in both rhetoric and in policy. So he's clearly apparently shored up some more support there in a variety of ways. But what do you think, Zach? Since you know some normal people, we've established that maybe you're not normal, but you've met some normal people, right? Is there just more of a sense of unity now? So the larger issues are more of a medium and longer term issues? I don't know.
Well, yeah. So I have sort of a shorter term thought and a longer term thought. On the shorter term, there's no unity. What has happened instead is the classic quote from a movie which I've never seen, but what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. After November 5th, there was a great deal of lamentation from the right's enemies, and so people are riding high. I know I am. And so when you're feeling like that, it's not a crushing victory in the sense of, everything's over with, we've won for all time, because fortunately that never happens. But I think most people are not thinking of, we need to break the country up now to defend ourselves. So I definitely no unity. I would say more there's a feeling of victory on the right, and on the left, they're demoralized right now. And I would say that someone brought up Fetterman before as a potential sort of new leader of the Democrats, at least heading in a different direction. But I'm not so sure how well he's going to do, because the Democrats are in the grip of what Eric Voegelin would call a Gnostic political religion. And so all the woke craziness, I don't think that that aspect of the party and all of the intersectionality, grievance, oppression interest groups are going to go away without a fight. I would say right now they're just demoralized, and they're a little lost, because it was the Republicans control all branches of government now, which is a disaster from their point of view. And they're even more than that, they're demoralized because their narrative of history has been completely destroyed. The idea, the end of history, the leftist views are, inevitable. For years, people harped on demographics are destiny. Nothing can stop our triumph over the Republicans. Well, that doesn't look necessarily to be true. So that's the short term where people are, and there'll probably maybe be some more pushes for federalism by whichever side is losing. Notably, though, in the sort of slightly longer short term, some people like Daniel McCarthy have pointed out that things aren't actually looking great for the Democrats electorally. When the 2030 census happens, a lot of Democrat states are going to lose a lot of electoral votes that are going to be, and representatives that are going to be going into red states. It will also depend who's president in 2030, because there's a lot of griping that the Census Bureau messed up the 2020 census, resulting in seats being allocated to blue states where they actually should not have. So that will definitely be an issue if there's a Republican in the White House in 2030. Going to the more longer term, sort of, the future of the U.S., it's all empires end. And it's a question of when that will happen. And I think there's the dynamic ultimately is, so we just, we did an episode on realism in December, and realism, it just assumes the state, the domestic politics is a black box. But realism is not only a theory for states, it is a theory for groups. And personally, it is how I view domestic politics. And there's a spectacular essay called The Balance of Power in Society, which predates structural realism. It came out in the 30s, I think, but by a great guy named Frank Tannenbaum. Highly recommend his work. But the short version is society, there's a fixed amount of social power. And in a healthy society, it's divided among the core institutions of society, which are the family, the church, the market, and the state. And throughout history, we can identify periods where one institution will acquire more power, and it can only acquire this power by taking the power from the other institutions. And as in our current epoch, that is the state, and as the state acquires more and more power, it comes to resemble, as it were, a nuclear weapon. And realist logic then comes into play for the various groups within society of, we must control the state, or because the future is radically uncertain and we can never know the intentions of other groups, they could have the power, and goodness knows what they'd do to us with it. They'll either inflict their wokeness on us and all that entails, or, oh my goodness, the right will inflict, Christian fascism and whatever that dystopian novel with the red dresses is. So in the long term, really, the only way that a sort of catastrophic, potentially, clash of these various interests can be avoided, in my view, is for the decentralization of state power back to where it properly belongs among other social institutions. There's not a great record of that happening. So when the U.S. does join the ash heap of history, I think that this centralization will probably be a large role in that. And I'm not so sure whether a national divorce can happen without, just the country collapsing into interscene war and conflict. So rather a tragic view of the future, but there is a chance for hope, I'd say.
Well, and one thing to kind of build off of Zach's point there is I think the one sentiment that's probably the most popular across the country when it comes to politics is that something is fundamentally wrong with the government. And that's probably, not 80% of Republicans, right, hold that view. The other 20% are just kind of waiting for the Trump era to go around, and they think they're going to reclaim the Republican Party again. The Democratic Party is probably half and half, but the half that's happy, are the ones that are disproportionately in power, and the kind of the woke base is overly represented within the Democratic political establishment, right? So they're not interested. And then amongst independents, probably half and half. Half are just kind of status quo sort of types that just don't like having strong opinions, and the other half are the Joe Rogans and the pre-Trump Elon Musks and so I bet you there's probably about 70% of the country that recognizes something systemically wrong. I think a lot of those folks are pinning their hopes that Trump is going to usher in some sort of radical reform. Should that not end up happening, what happens going forward, I think is going to be very interesting, because I don't think you're going to have some sort of return to political norms as they were in the pre-Trump era. I think there's going to be something more radical emerging from that. So I think there are kernels there that both in the medium and the long term you can see that sort of movement going again. I just think right now, just kind of the uniqueness of this current political environment, you have on one side not enough power to fundamentally change the blue side of the political aisle, and the other one is that the radicals just see their political hopes with Trump right now.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Tho. Thank you, Zach, for joining. All of you out there, Happy New Year, 2025. In spite of everything I might be saying, I think it's going to be all right. It's going to be okay. And so have a great year. We'll see you next time.